crossroads. There is a growing concern of a very real possibility we could be moving back towards a Cold War era of nuclear threats. Now, the
Yeah.
United States is considering expanding its nuclear arsenal, a significant change in policy. The New START treaty between the United States and Russia, which again they were talking about reducing their nuclear weapons, that is expiring in 2026, and it does not appear it's going to be renewed. The hope that we could live in a world without
They
nuclear weapons that
suspended
is
it
quickly
already.
becoming a thing of the past. But even with that treaty, other countries now declare that nuclear weapons are part of its defensive strategy against the United States. So, what's really going on? How did we get to this point? And is there any real credibility to the threats now being made? Well, let's start from what's being said on the U.S. side. Now, look, last Friday, Pranay Vadi, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Arms Control at the White House, spoke at the Arms Control Association. And he said that absent a change in nuclear strategy by U.S. adversaries like China and Russia, the U.S. may need to expand its nuclear arsenal. Watch.
Russia, the PRC, and North Korea are all expanding and diversifying their nuclear arsenals at a breakneck pace, showing little or no interest in arms control. Those three, together with Iran, are increasingly cooperating and coordinating with each other in ways that run counter to peace and stability, threaten the United States, our allies and our partners, and exacerbate regional tensions. They are also freely proliferating advanced missile and drone technology among one another and around the globe. Absent a change in the trajectory of adversary arsenals, we may reach a point in the coming years where an increase from current deployed numbers is required. And we need to be fully prepared to execute if the president makes that decision, if he makes that decision. If that day does come, it will result from a determination that more nuclear weapons are required to deter our adversaries and protect the American people and our allies and partners.
Now, why is this speech important? Well, according to the New York Times, it confirms what officials have been saying for more than a year. They said this, that Mr. Vadi confirmed what officials have been saying in private conversations and closed congressional testimony again for more than a year. They say it is the inevitable outgrowth, they have argued, of China's rapid nuclear expansion and Russia's repeated threats to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They note that China is on a path to match the number of American and Russian deployed nuclear weapons by 2035, according to the Pentagon's public estimates. They note that Mr. Putin has fixated on unusual weapons, including an undersea nuclear torpedo that can be launched across the Pacific to destroy the west coast of the United States. And the United States has warned that in recent months that Russia has a program underway to put a nuclear bomb into orbit. In other words, other countries are actively expanding their nuclear programs, but they're also, again, developing new types of nuclear weapons. If any of you were alive during the Cold War, you might remember the talk of Star Wars, and I don't mean the movie, I mean the military program. There were discussions of putting nuclear weapons in space, and that is important because, well, if you put them into orbit and you can launch them from orbit, you can't intercept them using conventional interceptors. It's a way to basically change the rules of the game. Same thing with undersea nuclear torpedoes. If you have those, of course, conventional systems to intercept nuclear weapons might not work anymore. And so these are things that change the game. These are systems that change the rules on what was, again, the whole idea of nuclear deterrence. The idea that other countries have them, yes, but again, if you use them, there's mutual destruction, and so people don't use them because there's a risk in doing so. Again, remember, folks, part of the nature of nuclear weapons is that they're deterrence. The hope is that we never have to use them. I think most countries hope they never have to use them. They are tools for mutually assured destruction. If one country could destroy another without risk, well, there is less of a guarantee of them not using them. In other words, if a foreign adversary were to, for example, have the ability to use a nuclear weapon to eliminate the threats to their agendas, well, there is a chance they could use them still. The reason they don't is because the threat against them in return, the retaliation, is too high. And so this kind of game is played where other countries just maintain this tension but don't go beyond that. That is what is now at risk. Now, the United States has so far kept to its commitment to phase out nuclear weapons. Again, the U.S. has been trying to get rid of them, at the very least. And at the very least, again, they're not expanding the programs. They have been improving their nuclear weapons, but again, they're not growing them, we're not developing new types, we're not advancing the technology so much. And changing this, which they're not discussing doing, expanding the number of nuclear weapons, again, maybe even developing newer and even more effective nuclear weapon systems or things that change the game, space-based nuclear weapons and otherwise. That would be a significant change in policy for the United States. Now look, back to the statements that the United States may again expand its nuclear programs. Let me show you a bit more on that from Newsweek. They say that Vadi's comments come against the backdrop of growing tensions between the U.S. and both Russia and China, sparking fears of an all-out war. In May, they note, Russia conducted tactical nuclear weapons drills in response, they said, to provocative statements and threats by individual Western officials. They note that hosts and guests on Russian state TV have repeatedly threatened nuclear strikes on Western powers, including the US, France, the UK, and the Netherlands. And remember, the context of that is that all these other countries have talked about the possibility of joining the war alongside Ukraine against Russia. And Russia, seeing that as a threat to them, which it would be, frankly, are using nuclear threats as a deterrent to that possibility, suggesting again that mutually assured destruction is in place, that if the free world wants to come against Russia and that would ensure Russia's possible destruction, that Russia would use these weapons that assure mutual destruction if that line is crossed. But the big thing again is that they're using nuclear threats, and the threat of that is again bringing the world back into this Cold War era where nuclear weapons and the use of nuclear weapons are again on the table. And notes at the time that on Wednesday, Russia's President Vladimir Putin warned he could deploy conventional missiles within range of Western powers after a number of these gave Ukraine permission to hit Russian military targets on its own soil with their weapons for the first time. Something that has been cleared, by the way, now. Now, it seems possible the United States is expanding its nuclear program, so this is not just empty talk. But I'll be talking about all this more after a quick break. Come to Mac. A new nuclear arms race is brewing as treaties against nuclear weapons are beginning to falter and as global conflicts are beginning to stir again. For the first time in decades, the United States is considering expanding its nuclear arsenal, rather than reducing the number of weapons, which for a good while has been the policy. Now, this isn't just empty talk either. This is Semaphore. Here's what they had to say. They say the U.S. believes it needs to adopt a more competitive approach to non-proliferation, the idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons, and also of arms control. In light, they say, of rising global tensions and to, quote, make certain adjustments to our posture and capabilities. And they cite those comments to a senior administration official. It says that the administration, the White House, they still have hopes, they say, to bring its geopolitical rivals to the negotiating table, but wants to show there will be consequences for rebuffing talks, the official added. They note that Russia and China, quote, will face a diminished security environment if they continue to refuse to engage. And they note that while they offered relatively few specifics about the future policy changes, this official with the White House told Semaphore that the administration's increasingly forceful thinking was reflected in decisions to develop a new nuclear gravity bomb and efforts to extend the life of some Ohio-class nuclear submarines. Those are, of course, the doomsday subs that the United States have. And the idea of a nuclear gravity bomb would be kind of a next-gen U.S.-built nuclear weapon, meaning, again, that we may be joining the arms race yet again. Now, they note the administration is also considering how its nuclear forces may have to evolve further when facing rising nuclear threats, because, again, they're talking about space war, they're talking about space-based nuclear weapons, they're talking about nuclear torpedoes and things we have not yet had to deal with, which require, of course, new forms of nuclear deterrence if we believe those weapons are being fielded. It notes as well that they're working to ensure that key allies as well have long-range strike capabilities and surveillance abilities needed to defend themselves, the official said. And that has deeper implications as well, Because remember that the United States is essentially the leader of the free world, and as part of that leadership, we also help defend many countries in the free world. And that includes, if unfortunately nuclear weapons are a threat, the deployment of systems to detect and intercept nuclear weapons for U.S. allies. Something that has been happening, for example, in parts of Europe, something that's been happening in parts of Asia, including previously in South Korea. It was very controversial with the Chinese Communist Party and other countries, meaning that we may be re-entering that type of very delicate ground, something very controversial and something that goes very strongly in the line of risking, I would say, at the very least, threats of war. Now, they note as well the White House is also starting to lay the groundwork for the key nuclear issues Biden would face if he is reelected. They note that while the U.S. and Russia remain bound legally by the New START treaty, again, the Obama-era one, the last agreement limiting the world's two largest nuclear arsenals, that is set to expire in 2026. And that means whoever comes into office next, we'll see who it is, will have to face the ending of the New START treaty and have to figure out what America's position is going to be going forward with nuclear weapons. Now, this is all happening in the backdrop that Russia is preparing for military exercises alongside Cuba and the Caribbean, and what appears to really just be a show of force on America's doorstep. American military news said that with these things, Russia is preparing to deploy aircraft and combat naval vessels to the Caribbean to conduct military exercises in the coming weeks. Its first exercises in the Western Hemisphere involved both air and sea activity in 5 years, a senior administration official told McClatchy and the Miami Herald. And notes that the Biden administration is not expressing concern over the development, with the official stating it poses, quote, no direct threat to the United States. But the administration believes Moscow intends to use the exercises as a messaging tactic, after President Joe Biden gave Ukraine permission last week to fire U.S.-made weapons across its border into Russia to defend its territory. And remember, given the fact that the U.S. is now allowing Ukraine to strike some targets within Russia, although not able to target the Kremlin, not able to target Moscow, that Russia was countering that with nuclear threats. And as part of that nuclear threat, they've again done something that looks a whole lot like the Cuban Missile Crisis. They note that Russia has sailed ships into the Western Hemisphere every year from 2013 to 2020 and has sent flights through the regions that violated the airspace of U.S. allies. But the anticipated activity, this big upcoming exercise, would be the first coordinated air and sea exercise of its kind since 2019 during the Trump administration, according to this official. So, in other words, the military exercise, it's not technically out of the norm. It's being pumped up a bit too much by the media in some regards, right? Russia did the same thing or something very similar when Trump was in office. This is not necessarily unusual, but it does send a message, and that's the important part with this. The United States and other countries, they also tend to hold exercises like this sometimes. There are a lot of different reasons they do this. One, for example, is a show of force. You want to demonstrate to another country that military, the use of force is on the table if they overstep certain boundaries. And you move your military into their territorial waters or nearby, and you hold a big exercise as a show of force. Another is to carry out surveillance using onboard systems. For example, if other ships are nearby, if, for example, they go near sensitive outlets or something like that, they can detect certain signals, and there's a type of surveillance that is carried out oftentimes. And another is to move troops and forces to a region without saying you're going to do it for hostile reasons. And that's, of course, one of the bigger concerns that people often have with these types of exercises, that if you were to, for example, launch a war against another country, you would need to move your military assets to, for not giving a reason, the country might believe you're planning to invade them. But if you just say, hey, we're going to hold military exercises close to you, then it gives an alibi for moving those forces. And so, again, that is one of the concerns that comes about with this, that it does look like a military preparedness exercise. again, putting assets in place for potential invasion, which is, again, part of the show of force and part of the threat that comes about from things like this. Take, for example, the Chinese Communist Party and the concerns that it could surround Taiwan with its military. What do? Well, they don't attack Taiwan. They don't actually cut it off. But they do move their military assets and encircle Taiwan and then call it a military exercise. But also there's just the tit-for-tat reasons. One country does it, another's region, so they do it right back. And oftentimes it's done to say that, hey, you're threatening us, we'll threaten you right back. Don't cross the line. But the current operation with Russia and Cuba, it does have some additional significance because, again, this comes in the midst of a lot of nuclear threats. This comes, again, in the context that the U.S. has now given Ukraine to strike some targets in Russia, and Russia making nuclear threats in retaliation on that. And this, again, paired with Russian operations alongside Cuba, well, that brings back memories of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russia was, again, moving military assets to that same region, and again, working with Cuba, and concerns that they were going to start placing nuclear weapons in Cuba, which again presents a very real nuclear threat to the United States. The image, in other words, the optics of this are reminiscent of that time, and they carry that same implication. And again, remember, this is happening as these global tensions are rising. Some of the surface threats over nukes have been pretty loud as well. Now, remember that since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, there's been a lot of discussion around nuclear weapons. There's been concerns, for example, that Russia may use smaller nukes against key parts of Ukraine. In fact, they've even been pressed to do it by some of their military leaders. Russia has had concerns of the United States as well, moving nuclear weapons to the region. Remember, for example, the United States is talking about moving nuclear weapons to the United Kingdom. In terms of public statements, most countries that have nuclear weapons or that are trying to develop nuclear weapons, well, they tend to reiterate that nuclear war should be avoided. But statements are also just statements. Actions speak louder than words. While they talk, for example, about the possibility of nuclear war and say we should always avoid this at all costs, many of them are developing them, many of them are making threats with them, many of them are calling out their adversaries and suggesting their adversaries are making threats with them, which necessitates their own use and own fielding of these as a defensive deterrent. And there's also, again, some legitimate concern that the threats are escalating. Newsweek said in February that President Vladimir Putin warned that Russia's strategic nuclear forces are in a full state of readiness during his annual address to the nation. And speaking in Moscow during that time, they said, the Russian president said, quote, Russia won't let anyone interfere in its internal affairs. They noted as well that Western nations on this, that Putin added, quote, that they must realize that we also have weapons that can hit targets on their territory. All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. Don't they get that? Putin said. In other words, again, Russia was being faced with the prospect of Western nations joining the war alongside Ukraine against Russia. And the use of nuclear weapons, the threat of that, was the deterrent they used to prevent that from taking place. Now, there's also the issue of space-based weapons, as I've been discussing, and concerns as well of that form of escalation. And there have been some real concerns around this as well. In fact, in May, just recently, NBC said the United States has said Russia likely launched a counter-space weapon into the same orbit as a U.S. government satellite, an accusation Moscow rejected at the time as disinformation. But they note that at the time, again, during a Pentagon briefing, that the Pentagon spokesperson said the U.S. has assessed that Moscow deployed the satellite on May 16th. They said, quote, Russia launched a satellite into low Earth orbit that we assess is likely a counter-space weapon, presumably capable of attacking other satellites in low Earth orbit, he said. And noted as well at the time that the latest space feud comes 3 months after Washington raised fears that Russia was developing a space-based nuclear weapon potentially designed to target U.S. satellites. And notes that Moscow strongly denied it, with President Vladimir Putin saying that he was categorically against the deployment of nuclear weapons in space. And then something else happened. because shortly after that, we saw this very strange article come out on the Chinese Communist Party and its space programs, also in May, soon after that last story. Daily Mail said that China's top secret space plane has released a mysterious object into Earth's orbit just 372 miles above the surface. It notes that the craft, named Shenlong after a spirit dragon of Chinese mythology, launched last December and has since been found to release several objects into orbit, with some sending strong signals over North America. They know that China has been very secretive about the space plane, only describing its purpose as providing technical support for the peaceful use of space.
Uh-huh.
Now, also, what happened around the same exact time as the incidents with the CCP space plane? Well, one of the Chinese Communist Party's main state-run news outlets, the Global Times, also released this. And this was from their editor-in-chief, one of the mouthpieces, again, of the Chinese Communist Party. Around the same time as that spaceplane incident, this is what they said, quote, "As the U.S. strategic containment of China has increasingly intensified, I would like to remind again that we have plenty of urgent tasks, but among the most important ones is to rapidly increase the number of commissioned nuclear warheads and the DF-41S, the strategic missiles that are capable to strike long range and have high survivability in the Chinese arsenal." That's, again, China's nuclear weapons. They say this is the cornerstone of China's strategic deterrence against the U.S., and they said that we must be prepared for an intense showdown between China and the U.S. This is, again, one of the mouthpieces of the CCP. And they add as well, in that scenario, a large number of Dongfeng 41 and JL-2 and JL-3, both intercontinental range submarine launch ballistic missiles, will form the pillar of our strategic will. And thus the number of China's nuclear warheads must reach the quantity that makes U.S. elites shiver should they entertain the idea of engaging in a military confrontation with China. Well, everyone, that's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us, and as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free.